It is June 5th, 2025, and President Trump is complaining that Chinese President Xi Jinping is extremely tough and hard to make a deal with. Interesting, given that one of Trump's top employees, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, was just declaring to the world that China poses an imminent threat to Taiwan, declaring to the world that Washington's regional partners need to really step it up, not just with defense spending, but with preparations for war with China. When you look at everything that the US is saying, it does not seem like they want peace. And yet, Trump is somehow surprised that Beijing is not willing to just roll over and give him whatever he wants, when it's clear exactly what Washington is preparing. All of this as South Korea also now has a new president who isn't giving the US whatever they want and who's actually talking about viewing China as a strategic partner, something that the neocons do not want to hear. So, what does this mean for the overall conflict? Well, we got into all of the latest with the special guest earlier. So, let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is KJ No, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and co host of the China Report on Breakthrough News. KJ, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Pleasure to be with you, Rachel.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here as the US and China appear to be in kind of a continued deadlock. We did have that agreement that they made during talks in Switzerland last month, but it hasn't exactly worked out as expected. And then today at 2 a.m. local time in Washington, D.C., President Trump gets on Truth Social and he says, quote, I like President Xi of China, always have and always will, but he is very tough and extremely hard to make a deal with. All right, how do you view the current trade dispute and Trump's rhetoric on it?
Well, I think he's correct that, President Xi is not a walkover, and certainly China is not going to let itself be out negotiated. But, let's just kind of go back to the framing of this. Uh, in Geneva, there was an agreement to lift the tariffs that were imposed between 145% to 245% on China, which is essentially an embargo. Trump rapidly realized that by embargoing Chinese trade, he was essentially hurting himself, destroying the US economy. And so then Besant rapidly pivoted, said to China, let's see if we can de escalate. And both countries reduced their tariffs, China to 10% on US goods and the US to 30% on Chinese goods. That was the ostensible agreement, but it seems to have run into a kind of a deadlock because the United States is really, really upset that China has not lifted its controls on rare earth elements. Now, one of the first things when the US did impose these extravagant tariffs on China was that China put controls on rare earth elements. And just to go, back into that context, rare earth elements are the 17 elements of the lanthanide group on the periodic chart. They're very, very rare. People say they're not rare, but actually they are rare. You ask them, name three rare earth elements, they can't because they're that rare, they've never heard of them. But they're rare and they're hard to extract. They're very, very hard to extract because they're not found in significant density to make it worthwhile. So China has about 70% monopoly on the production and the mining of rare earth elements, and a 90% monopoly on the refining and processing of rare earth elements. And these are essential across the stack for the manufacture of electronics and the manufacture of magnets and many, many things that are involved in military hardware. For example, the kind of dysprosium magnets that are necessary in order to deal with the high temperatures. You cannot do those with, ferrous steel. You have to use these rare earth elements in order that they can function inside the high heat of of a missile, for example, and they're necessary for guidance. They're also necessary for many, night vision goggles, etc. So China has put controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements. It could do a lot more, but right now it's just shooting. It's just a shot over the bow, and the U.S. is very, very upset about this. I mean, they're stamping their feet because they want their rare earth elements, because without that, the U.S. military industrial complex, its weapons industry, doesn't function. Well, they should have thought about this first before, escalating to sanctions against China, and as well as essentially escalating to war against China. China knows what the game is, they know what's happening. So they're not going to make things easy. They're certainly not going to sell the rope to the United States for them to hang China with. So they've still held off on that. And also, as soon as the tariffs were temporarily lifted in Geneva, the US, the very next day, they put sanctions on Huawei's Ascend chips. Huawei has been building these uh, AI chips that are comparable to the ones that NVIDIA has. And they built these chips because the US has put a total embargo on the chips that China can import or use. And uh, having created this kind of self sufficiency for China, forcing them into self sufficiency, Huawei has been selling these and using these around the world. And the Trump administration has said that no country and no corporation can use any of Huawei's Ascend chips anywhere in the world. Essentially, they're claiming extraterritorial jurisdiction over the entire planet, including in China. They're saying to Chinese companies, you cannot use Huawei Ascend chips in China itself, as Chinese companies. So this is absurd. And they've also, threatened to ban or revoke the visas of all or most Chinese students studying in the United States. So these are just incredibly belligerent actions. And of course, the Chinese are not happy with that. And so they're moving slowly. They want to see if the United States will come to its senses. They certainly don't want to escalate further. But what we're looking at is this continued trade war, which is really, in my opinion, a continuation of the Trans Pacific Partnership. The TPP was a plan to exclude China from the global trade regime. And the Trump tariff regime looks like it was designed to do that. That is, to force massive tariffs on China and force all countries that are doing trade with China to stop trade with China on the pain of continued high tariffs. That they would either have to join the United States as a bloc, or and sanction China, or they would have these massive tariffs levied on them. That's not working, for the reasons that we pointed out earlier. The US simply doesn't have the industrial supply chains. It needs to trade with other countries. It's just hurting itself if it puts a tariff on its own imports. But I think that because there is this larger context of a trade war, which is really a preparation for kinetic war, the Chinese are holding their cards, and they're not moving, and they want the United States to really de-escalate, because we're moving into very, very dangerous territory. And I think the speech of Pete Hegseth at the Shangri-La summit is also another indicator. So we're in very dangerous territory, and the Chinese are not going to come to the table to negotiate with the U.S. until the U.S. shows some more good faith.
Yeah, and I even just listening to that, to what we heard about that speech from Hegseth, I'm going, okay, you're making these statements out here. You know that Beijing can hear these, and I appreciate your explanation when it comes to this back and forth on trade, because Trump is acting like he can announce all of these massive tariffs on China, and then Beijing's just supposed to fold and do whatever he wants, and then you almost act shocked when it doesn't. And doesn't take into account the fact that Beijing is paying attention to everything that's happening overall here, right? The everything that the US has been doing up until this point. And, going back to that speech that Hegseth did make when he addressed a security summit of US allies in Singapore late last week, he warned that Beijing poses an imminent threat to Taiwan. And then he went on to say, and I thought this was very interesting, if deterrence fails and if called upon by the commander in chief, we are prepared to do what the Department of Defense does best, to fight and win decisively. Now, I don't know that the US has ever fought and won decisively, at least in the 21st century, we'll say. But how do you view Hegseth's comments? Obviously, they aren't made lightly. And is this about getting US proxies in the region to increase defense spending, or is this more so about literally preparing them for war?
I think it's a preparation for war. I think it was like the closing argument of a prosecuting attorney in a courtroom for war. Certainly, they want the proxies to, do a large part of it. It fits into the larger pattern. Remember, a few weeks ago, Pete Hegseth's memo to the Pentagon was leaked, where he said that we have to pivot to China, prepare for war against China over Taiwan. This is why we're reprioritizing. And the larger context of this is Elbridge Colby, who was the 2018 author of the National Defense Strategy. He's the one who actually officially, in black and white, in paper, on ink, named China as the official enemy. In his 2018 National Defense Strategy, he wrote a book called Strategy of Denial. And the Strategy of Denial is essentially a book that says we need to go to war with China over Taiwan. We need to go to war with China. Taiwan will be the trigger. We will wrongfoot them, make them look bad, and then we'll rally all of our allies, and then we will destroy China. That's that's the book in a nutshell. And he has his entire, he has an entire website, the Marathon Institute, etc. He has his own think tank, but he's out of CNAS, and they've been obsessively scheming and planning war against China at least since 2008, 2009, from the Center for New American Security, for where he was a fellow. This is direct continuity with the Biden administration. Biden administration has 18 members of CNAS in their administration obsessed with war with China. Jake Sullivan, Eli Ratner, Kurt Campbell, all of them. The ghouls that we've discussed before. Elbridge Colby, who is the grandson of William Colby, the CIA chief who was responsible for the Phoenix program in Vietnam. He is part of this coterie of China hawks that have really, really put a lot of thought and effort into how do we start a war and how do we destroy China. And it looks like that entire speech was written by Elbridge Colby, or most of it. It boils down to this, China is a threat. China is evil. China is a threat. We're preparing for war with China. We are going to rehearse and recruit our vassals for war, logistically, in terms of interoperability, weapons, sustainment, repair. And this will be a world war across the entire Pacific. And this war is ours to win. But we are urgent. We need to start this war right away. We're desperate for war. That's the message of this, speech. And the key thing to understand is that Pete Hegseth has said, and this is why I say it's a declaration of war, is that Pete Hegseth has said essentially to China that if you exercise your sovereign rights as a sovereign country over your sovereign territory, we will destroy you. That is what he said, because Taiwan is part of China. The UN recognizes this. The US State Department recognizes this. It agreed, in 3 communiques. It's on the website. Taiwan is part of China. Certainly the Chinese see it as part of China. The Taiwan Constitution itself recognizes itself as part of China. Every country on the planet recognizes Taiwan as part of China. And the United States, Pete Hegseth, has said to China, if you exercise your sovereign rights for reunification, or if you take action to reunify Taiwan, then we will go to war against you. And I think it doesn't get any more obvious than that, that is essentially a declaration of war. I mean, it's a coded declaration, but it doesn't take much decoding. The United States has essentially signaled that it is going to go to war, and then it threw a whole bunch of lies in just to make it more convincing. I can unpack those if you want to, but it's an extraordinarily, extraordinarily dangerous and belligerent action. And as I said, it's like the bar drunk, who is spoiling for a fight. Pete Hegseth, is that bar drunk. He's the DUI hire, and he is, starting to throw punches.
Yeah, it's incredibly concerning. And I know we were looking back at that, memo that Hegseth was giving to the Pentagon saying, okay, it's time for us to figure out how to not only fight a war, but to quote unquote win a war against China. And when it comes to Beijing's response, I mean, they accused Hegseth of attempting to sow division, and I would say rightfully so, in Asia. And they warned him not to play with fire on Taiwan. I mean, Beijing keeps warning, they keep saying, hey, you're taking this too far. Exactly as we saw with Russia, they kept warning, but yet the Trump administration doesn't seem to be getting it. So, how do you view the state of tensions? And as you were mentioning there with some of Hegseth's other language that he was throwing in there in that speech, what does that tell us about where the U.S. is headed?
I think the U.S. is headed in a very, very dangerous direction. I've called this the grizzly bear fallacy, that 6% of the U.S. population believes that it can fight a grizzly with their bare hands and beat it. It's absolutely absurd. It's insanity. But the U.S. believes that it can beat China in as a peer competitor in war in its front yard. That is not possible. This is the US's war to lose. It doesn't matter how many proxies or how much weaponry or how much strategizing or doctrine or offsets it has. It is not going to win that war. The US is going to lose this war. And the only ace in the hole that it has, which I'm quite certain is what they're preparing, if you read papers from the Atlantic Council, makes it very clear, is that they're planning to go nuclear. They're planning to use nuclear weapons against China. They want to nuke China. All the weapons platforms that they're sowing along the First Island chain are dual use. Typhoon weapons, Typhoon missiles, Tomahawk missiles, all of these things are dual use. They can be purposed and can fire nuclear warheads. So they're incredibly dangerous. But, once again, the Chinese are saying that this is playing with fire. In a conventional war, there's no way the United States even has a chance of fighting and defeating China. It's like that line from Bruce Lee. He says, I don't fear the person who has trained 10,000 techniques. I fear the person who has trained one technique 10,000 times. That defense of Taiwan against U.S. aggression is what China has, it's built its military around that. China doesn't have an offensive military. It hasn't been to war in almost half a century. Last time was 1979, 3.5 weeks with Vietnam. But it doesn't go abroad seeking war, but it will certainly defend Taiwan against the U.S. weaponization of it. And so this is why it's so dangerous. China has said this is a provocation. It's sowing division. It is, projecting. It is playing with fire. And I think they are absolutely correct. This is a very, very dangerous thing. And it's packed. The entire argument is built on lies. I'll just give you a few, points about that. They say China has had this massive military buildup, and therefore it's building up, analogy to Hitler, etc., that they're preparing to invade and take over the rest of the planet. That's not true. China has continuously reduced the size of its military. Since 1985, it's cut its troop size by 2 million. In the past decade, it reduced its troops by 300,000. Yes, the military budget is growing, but it's growing because the Chinese economy is growing. So essentially, it's getting a COLA every year. It is, increasing usually lower than the amount that the GDP itself grows. And of course, it is preparing to defend its perimeter. It's preparing to defend its littoral waters because it knows that the United States has encircled it with over 330 bases and is constantly rehearsing, kinetic attacks on China. Literally, the entire South China Sea and the First Island chain has been turned into a staging area for war. And China is seeking to defend that. It's creating a defensive perimeter and defensive capacity, primarily through, missiles. So, but this notion that China is belligerent, that it's growing, that it has a huge navy, its navy is actually half the tonnage of the United States. The US has a tonnage which is close to 4 million tons. China is less than half of that, and you still have to count the Coast Guard to get to that figure. And then, they say, well, China's belligerent in the South China Sea, etc. Well, the South China Sea is a place where the sea territory is contested. It is contested by 6 different countries, and all their claims overlap and intersect. China is simply one of them. So if you single China out, that doesn't make any sense. Yes, China has built some military installations on some of the islands, but so have all of the others. All 6 claimants have built military installations, and 5 of them have airstrips. And then this notion that China is being belligerent, and attacking ships. China has sprayed water on Philippine ships. They've sprayed water. But, just as a point of comparison, if you think of Indonesia, which is also a claimant to the South China Sea, Indonesia has sunk 556 ships and, shot on them, set them on fire, sunk 556 ships. So compared to that, China is an absolute Boy Scout, choir boy. I mean, it does nothing. And, these ocean territory battles are like hockey games. They get rough. Even NATO allies have, come to blows over ocean territory, the Turbo Wars, the Halbut Wars, etc. This has happened in the North Atlantic as well. So if you take all of that into context, no, China is not belligerent. It has actually been a Boy Scout in this whole, very, very rough and tumble area. And it doesn't have this massive, aggressive military buildup. And it is not a threat. The only threat it is a threat of a good example for countries that can break away from this neo-colonial system. And that is what the US doesn't want. And that is what Hegseth sees as, dangerous. And that is why they're accelerating towards war.
Yeah, I think that that's an incredibly important point to keep in mind as you're watching just all of the propaganda that is out there about China alone, not even to mention, its society, its government, and so on and so forth, exactly as you were noting there. The last thing I wanted to bring up, because I think it's interesting how I know we talk a lot about the US and its proxies, right? It's relying on countries in the region to do its bidding to essentially fight this war. And now in South Korea, you have a brand new president months after the previous leader attempted and then failed to declare martial law. We now have Lee Jae-myung, who has referred to China as a strategic partner. He seems to be in a position of trying to get along with everyone at a time when the US, of course, wants war. At least that's what I got from looking into it. Is that a fair characterization? And what does this new president mean for South Korea on the foreign policy stage?
It means that there will be a significant shift in geopolitics. The US is actually very, very unhappy about Lee Jae-myung. They did not want him elected. They wanted, Yoon Suk-yeol, the previous uh, president who was impeached for declaring martial law, because Washington characterized him as Washington's perfect partner. What they meant was that he was the perfect partner for war. He was a walking wish fulfillment list. Anything Washington wanted, he got on his knees and he did it for them. He even sang American Pie for them. You know, he was the minstrel at the White House. You know, so he was doing everything he could to please the U.S. Warhawk class. And then he overstepped and he tried to create a dictatorship, which, in my opinion, the United States was 100% behind, because they would have loved for him to have been a dictator, because you need a dictatorship in times of war, just as, Zelensky right now is the dictator of Ukraine. And Yoon Suk-yeol was also preparing to instigate war against North Korea. If war had happened, been triggered against North Korea, Russia would have been pulled in. It would have been a horizontal escalation, because North Korea and Russia have a mutual defense treaty, and the United States would have gotten operational control over South Korea's 3.6 million troops, because that's the way that it's set up. That's the way that the treaties are set up. If there's war, the U.S. gets operational control of all of South Korean troops, and then the U.S. could have used those to wage war against China and against Russia. So this was a very, very dangerous moment. And Lee Jae-myung was blocked by the people going out into the streets, blocking, armored cars, climbing over walls, vaulting over walls, fighting special warfare forces who had been told to drag the legislators out and keep them from voting down the martial law declaration. They voted it down anyway, and then he has been impeached. And because he was impeached, there was a 60-day, snap election, which Lee Jae-myung won. And Lee Jae-myung has said that we're going to balance and we're going to have good relations with China and everybody else. And we are also going to look out for South Korea's interests and not U.S. interests. And that is making the U.S. Ruling class very, very unhappy. It has broken off or undermined a large chunk of their strategic calculations for war against China in the Northeast corridor. And so I think that we're not out of the woods yet. I think there'll be more twists and turns. Lee Jae-myung was almost assassinated when he was, last year. Somebody, tried to drive a knife through his carotid artery, many, many times. It was brutal. He almost died from it. And you can see that there are factions of the deep state that are going to claim that, this was a fraudulent election. These are people from CPAC, Morstan, etc. They're going to claim that it was a Chinese interfered fraudulent election. So I expect more mischief. I expect a lot of pressure on Lee Jae-myung. He's also facing a lot of economic headwinds, simply with South Korea's economy has been kneecapped because the U.S. has forced South Korean electronics companies and auto manufacturers to stop doing production and trade with China. So South Korea is in a very, very bad place. So he has his work cut out for him, and there will be continued pressure on Lee Jae-myung because the U.S. wants to mold him and make sure that he doesn't undermine any of these belligerent war preparations that Yoon Suk-yeol has set up. So more to come, and I would watch that, quadrant very carefully.
Yeah, that's good to know. And I'm glad that you alerted me to it, because it's so interesting how it's being reported here in the US. I will say, I'm very curious to see where things go from here. And yeah, that's the last thing that Washington wants to see, is an elected leader in one of their chosen proxy states saying, hey, we need to focus here on what's best for our country. And war is certainly not best for them. A lot at stake here, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. KJ No, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and co host of the China Report on Breakthrough News. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you, Rachel. Always a pleasure.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.